Jangan salah. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Ya, Bu. Halo, ya, Bu. Halo, Bu Priska. Bu Priska.
Aduh, Cik.
Halo, Assalamualaikum. Ya, Bu.
Oh, Pak, bisa boleh saya pindahkan link Zoom-nya ke Bapak ya?
Oh iya, ke saya ini. Halo, Alice. Ada?
Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Halo.
Are you able to hear me?
So sorry.
You can hear me okay?
Okay, yeah, now clear. But your video not appear yet.
No, I'll turn it on in a minute.
Okay, no problem. So maybe we wait, yeah, until 35. So two more minutes, I think.
That's fine.
Okay, hello everybody. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yeah, we will start our course, our class soon. So please get ready for the class. And yeah, more people coming. Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. Hello, Alice and Ada.
Yes, I can see Ada is there. She's just hiding.
Yeah. So okay, yeah. So now we are just a guest lecture. No, it's not so formal meeting or formal lecture. So and okay. First, so is it okay to record this meeting?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so we start to record. Yeah. Yeah. Hello, everybody. To everybody, and now we are in the class, in online class, and with us already attend the Honorable Associate Professor Alice Huges. So forgive me if I make mistake to spell your name.
That's
And
fine. I'm used to it in Asia.
so how to the correct spell your name, pronunciation is your name?
My family name Hughes. So as if it was
Hughes.
spelled Huws, Hughes.
Huge. Okay. So Alice Huge, isn't it?
Just about.
Okay. Alice Huge. And yeah. So this guest lecture is a part of our program in Andalas University. to be a world-class university. And now we are inviting many many professors from foreign country. And so now it's kind of honorable to us. You can attend, accept our invitation to be a guest lecturer. And you have experience, right? Come to Padang in 2000, I forget. In which year?
I've been, I can't remember when it was either. A few years ago now, but I haven't visited Andalas University yet.
Okay. Yeah. Now, we want to continue this connection. And we got information from update from Ada how she do the research and project and regarding biodiversity, and it's so how to say, so interesting and advanced, I think. So now we are inviting you to share to us how the biodiversity mapping and modeling and recent update of the biodiversity mapping and modeling. So, and here in this room, in online room, attend student from my class in biodiversity mapping and modeling, and we have a course named biodiversity mapping and modeling, and also ecological landscape ecology, sorry. And so we are we're looking forward how the update or regarding the mapping and modeling. So that's why we're inviting you. And for the time, our class until 3:30 or 4:30 in your time, and maybe we can divide into like 1 hour or less or more presentation or a lecture from you, and then one hour less or more discussion. So how to start this course? So
I can share my screen and start talking with slides. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to virtually be here with all of you. I know some of the people in this virtual room, and I've had the great pleasure of spending a number of years working with both Ada, as you know, but also I can see Ade hiding in the audience. And so my interaction with former Andala students has been going for a few years. And I want all of you to realize just what an incredible region you live in for biodiversity. But there is a huge amount we don't yet know. Ada has told you in person about some of her work on bat biogeography and phylogeography, which I won't be dwelling on today. And I hope at some point Ade will be telling you some of his work on the phylogeny of karst geckos, which are an incredible group, which he's been working on through his MSc and now his PhD project. And I'm immensely proud of them both. You've got some fantastic students at Andalas, and I hope that by building capacity within your university, we can transform our knowledge of a hugely biodiverse but threatened region. So today I'm going to be mainly talking about various different spatial approaches we can use for mapping biodiversity and their context in terms of global conservation. Some of you will know that a lot of my work centers on trying to do analysis that can help make better conservation decisions. So I'm going to start off with introducing the scene and how we can actually use remote sensing to better understand threats to biodiversity. I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the modeling approaches we can apply in the state of data that relates to different facets of the environment. And I'm then actually going to talk a little bit about mapping wildlife trade, which is really important for this region, and of course has strong spatial linkages because of the defaunation of large areas for things like the pet trade. And then, as you've said, I'm looking forward to having a discussion with the students. And if you don't feel able to ask me questions now, then you're welcome to email me later. If you're not confident about asking a question in English, you're also welcome to write your questions in the chat, and I can reply orally at the end or write you answers later. So broadly, I'm going to be talking about how we can make our science, especially our spatial science, relevant for global conservation and biodiversity issues. It's important to note that late last year, there was a report by WWF International which stated we've seen a 69% decline in wild populations of wildlife since the 1960s. Now, a 69% decline is terrifying. But what is more terrifying, as you will see through this talk, is the gaps in data. So whilst you have an array of different species shown on this slide, and this image is from WWF, actually the number of species we have realistic and accurate data on is still remarkably low. And in order to fill those gaps, we need a huge amount of work, but we also need consistent data standards so that we can detect what species are doing and what these trends might look like. Many people state that we are on a planet that is in crisis. There are an estimated 1 million plant and animal species currently viewed as threatened with extinction. And we've already seen a loss of up to 2.5% of species of a range of vertebrates since the industrial period. So again, since the 1960s. And it's very difficult to glean this kind of figure because, as we saw with the WWF report that came out just 2 days ago, the Greater Mekong subregion in just 2 years has seen the description of over 380 new species. And so in an area like the GMS, like Southeast Asia, where the rate of species description is so high, there are many species that will be going silently extinct, for which we have not described them, and therefore their loss will go unnoticed. And there's a real need for better data in this region, as we can't understand what species we're losing if we don't understand what species we have. These figures include the loss of 50% of warm water corals, over 60% of forest cover. And there's an estimate, according to the FAO, of 10 million hectares of forest loss every year. But why are we in this state? And how can we actually make this more comprehensible to the general public? Well, according to the Global Planetary Boundary Framework, the 6th boundary was crossed last year. Now, the global planetary boundaries are a challenging concept because they are very conceptual and then they don't map very well onto the world as we know it. But what they basically tell us is how we are crossing into the point of no return for various spheres of the environment. And as you can see from all of these, we are moving in the wrong direction. And this is despite conventions like the Convention on Biodiversity having strong targets, which over the course of several decades should have taken us in a very different direction. The highest decline, according to this data, was in Latin America and the Caribbean, with an up to 94% decrease in monitored populations. Africa saw a 66% fall in wildlife populations since the 1970s. Asia Pacific, the region that we're all sitting in now, monitored populations fell by about half. And Southeast Asia is one of the regions that is projected to show some of the greatest threats to its biodiversity. But we are also seeing high climatic impacts across many parts of the world. And these figures are frightening, and they are only going to get worse, highlighting the need for better data across this region. And yet we're still failing to complete global targets. But why are we in this state? Why is it that as we move forward and we set new ambitious targets, we are failing to maintain biodiversity? Well, many people attribute it to population. And whilst it's true that we've seen an exponential explosion in population since 1900, and especially in the last 60 or so years, that shift is projected to decline into the future. So by 2050, we expect all regions except the African continent to be showing a net population decrease, with the African continent reaching that point by 2100. And so, whilst many people in the Western world continue to blame population, actually what we need to be thinking more about is how and what we consume, and the increasing disparity between developed economies and developing economies in terms of what we're consuming and where it's coming from. In fact, if we look at the consumption of regions like Europe, we'll find that whilst there is now relatively little production of things for domestic consumption, their overseas footprint has grown. And we've also seen an increase in the per capita footprints, with increasing meat consumption as well as the consumption of oils and sugars, leading to much bigger footprints than our parents and previous generations. And so across the world, with the exception of places like North Korea, we have seen this increase in diets and an increase in per capita footprints, which means even as we see these declines in population increases into the future, our impact on the planet is likely to continue to increase. Furthermore, we've seen a global homogenization of diets. And so whilst your parents will have eaten very similar diets to their parents, the diet that you're eating today is probably much more like the diet I grew up with than your parents did. And this is caused by basically the same crops being grown all over the planet, but also a homogenization, much more processed food. And in addition, the growth of oil crops like palm oil and soybean, often displacing rainforest and now being used for biofuel production, for huge numbers of other commodities, and being grown at the expense of primary forest areas. Now, I'm going to come back to this later, but these graphs serve to show us that we cannot stop destroying global biodiversity unless we think about how we consume. And understanding this includes a very important spatial component, which I'll come on to later. And in fact, if we look at what is driving the loss of forests and intact habitat across the planet, what we see is that across the tropics, commodity production is the main driver of loss of primary habitats, whilst in more temperate regions to the north, we see that forestry and forest production for commodities is the main driver of biodiversity loss and habitat destruction in those regions. So what do we do about it? And how do we aggregate the data we need to better understand what these trends look like? So firstly, we need to understand the drivers of loss. We need to think about how we can use different forms of data to develop solutions. And then we need to effectively communicate those solutions to diverse audiences to ensure that the people with the power to act on the data have the information they need in order to make informed solutions about conserving biodiversity. But firstly, how does this fit in the most recent rendition of the Convention on Biodiversity's goals? I was in Montreal late last year in December when the post-2020 framework, also known as the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, was launched. And this is broadly fitting into 4 sets of goals and 23 different targets, as well as 10 sub-targets that aim to basically turn around the global loss of biodiversity and help us better conserve diversity across this planet. And today I'm largely going to be focusing on elements of conservation biology and conservation science that fit in with goal A of this agenda. So first off, if we're going to set targets, we need to be able to actually move towards them. And one of the major differences between the Aichi targets, which ran from 2010 to 2020 and aimed to once again conserve global biodiversity, but all of them failed, is the fact that under this new agreement, we have something called the monitoring framework. And the monitoring framework assigns specific indicators to most of the targets so that we can see if we're going in the right direction. And if we're not going in the right direction, then we can do something about it. And so all of these different indicators are meant to be replicable, standardized, and allow us to just measure progress. But of course, to do this, we need to understand what data we have and if it's adequate. And unfortunately, whilst the GeoBond, so Global Biodiversity Observation Network's essential biodiversity framework, are part of this framework, it is not very well detailed. And the main species level indicator is the red list of species, which is not updated regularly enough to provide us with the kind of data we need to see if we're moving towards these targets. So to develop meaningful and effective target, we need to know diversity patterns, we need to know endemism patterns, and we need to know patterns of threat. And so let's think about what data looks like. Now, this rather messy map, and all of those of you who know me know I really like messy maps, is a map of the world's global biodiversity data according to basically GBIF for the land, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and OBIS for the oceans. The OBIS is an ocean biodiversity repository. The black lines in the ocean represent seaways, and the black lines on the land represent roads. The green areas represent cities, and the yellow areas represent where we have biodiversity data. And what we can see very clearly is the vast amount of biodiversity data. In fact, over 85% of all biodiversity data comes from just 2.5 kilometers of a road. This means if we are going to model biodiversity, we cannot include roads or distance from roads as a predictor in our models, because unfortunately the data is so biased that if we include this in our models, then we'll find that all species apparently like roads. But actually, it's just that it's much easier, of course, for researchers and now citizen scientists to access these areas. And so we have much better data in those more disturbed areas. Unfortunately, as we've seen in other analysis we've run, this has another problem. And that problem is that even if we look at all the biodiversity data and we find out that the vast majority is from next to a road, for many species, the majority of their distribution points are still at further distances from the road, meaning that this data that we have underrepresents the species which are most sensitive to disturbance. And that means that any analysis based on that data is going to overemphasize areas that are important to generalist species and may neglect and miss out areas that are particularly important for species that are less good at using human modified areas. So as I've said, 90% of data is from 2 kilometers of a road. And overall, at a 5-kilometer resolution, less than 4% of the world's surface has any data. And this means any analysis we do with it is going to represent a vanishingly small portion of the planet, which is highly disturbed. In addition, other data sets have inherent biases that also impact on the priorities that are generated from any form of analysis using this. So let's just break that down for a moment, just to see the percentage of the world covered at different resolutions. And so, of course, here we've got a number of different orders. So you've basically got birds, fish, you've got marine gastropods, mammals, more gastropods, the elasmobranchs, so things like the sharks and rays, Cnidaria, that's the jellyfish, annelids, the worms, reptiles, spiders, and amphibians. And what we see in terms of the area of the world's land and water surface that has data, if we're using a 5-kilometer resolution, we have a vanishingly small percentage of the world's land that has data for most of these groups. Now, earlier this year, a paper came out that was aiming to map out the protection of the world's insect species. Now, we have a paper in review saying what's wrong with that at the moment. But if we have such a vanishingly small portion of the planet that has data, and that area overrepresents highly disturbed areas, overrepresents low elevations, and overrepresents temperate forests, then anything it generates is going to be highly biased to the point of being meaningless for the vast majority of species. So the coverage for most groups is amazingly poor, and the resolution can hugely inflate coverage. For example, if we look at the percentage covered by birds, if we use a 10-kilometer resolution, we have 15% covered. If we're using a 5-kilometer resolution, that drops down to 8%. And for many of these groups, it's under 1%. For most invertebrates, less than 1% of the world's land surface has data. And this is why, whilst there are ambitious projects that try to use what data we have to map out protection, we cannot do it when the level of coverage is so underrepresentative. And even for the best studied vertebrates at a 5-kilometer resolution, none of them have more than 10% of the world's land surface covered. In terms of biome representation, most data comes from broadleaf and temperate forests, followed by boreal and taiga forests, which are basically cold, icy, and devoid of many species. And so if we look at the level of coverage, what we can see if we actually do these cartograms by the land cover type is we see temperate regions get overinflated, as do certain oceans. And the level of underrepresentation of some areas is so severe that we cannot actually reconstruct what those areas look like. And if we were to map it out this way, so again, this is looking at how inflated or deflated areas get in terms of coverage, the world's tropics have virtually no data, despite having the majority of the world's species, meaning that if we are using them to map out global biodiversity patterns, we simply cannot adequately represent most of the planet. And we need to apply extreme caution when we're trying to map out biodiversity patterns, given the level of pervasive biases that exist. And so the normal alternative that gets used to this point-based data are maps from aqua maps if they're fish, from bird life if they're birds, or from the IUCN or GARD if you're looking at terrestrial vertebrates. Unfortunately, we can't do this for plants or invertebrates because the level of taxonomic coverage is generally too low, though you see O over here is Odonata because there have been much higher efforts to digitize that of dragonflies. Now, unfortunately, just like with the point-based data, there are inherent biases in this data. Not only does it fail to represent plants or most invertebrate taxa, but different regions, different taxa, and different times of digitization all have different biases within them. So this is a map of amphibians in the United States, where a completely different technique was used to digitize species range boundaries, and the people digitizing where species were actually used county boundaries to define where species were. In panel B, we see a map of Odonata, so the dragonfly range boundaries, where the digitizers used river basins to digitize where species were. In C, we see range boundaries for reptiles, where they actually used 1.5 degree grid cells, so 111 or 60 kilometers to say where species were. And so we can see that whilst many people use this because they think it has a large representative coverage and that they will be using standardized approaches, that simply isn't the case, where different groups have used entirely different sets of standards in order to digitize where species are. Furthermore, we see strong political biases, and especially in the tropical to temperate transition, we see many people, for example, will use China as the northern range boundary for any Southeast Asian species, meaning that we get massive disparity. In fact, if we map out a minimum convex polygon, so that's basically joining the dots on a species range, and then we filter out habitat types according to a method I'll go on into a moment, we actually get better outcomes in terms of more realistically representing high resolution models from refining based on a number of different sets of strategies, minimum convex polygons, than if we use the IUCN data, for which the coverage is too low and you cannot get past the political range boundary biases. In fact, if we're looking at the most important point for bats in Southeast Asia, the IUCN maps will not allow you to reconstruct that because the level of coverage is too poor. In fact, if we were to map out the diversity of Southeast Asian bats using IUCN data, you might get a map that looks something like this, where the Xishuangbanner boundaries, so this is where Ada, Ade, and I were all living, and Ade is still based now. We can see the entirety of the political boundary mapped out in this data because it's been used so frequently. And unfortunately, between the lack of species description and the massive biases in the data, it's simply not usable. Furthermore, if we look at the levels of errors of omission and commission, so species range points that fall outside where they are meant to be, as well as inside, we see that for many groups, at least between 50% in the case of amphibians and 24% in the case of birds, range points for each species falls outside where that species is meant to be. Furthermore, we find in other analysis we've done that the IUCN map ranges is typically about 10 times the size of the map if we model where that species is, meaning that not only does it overinflate the area the species is, which is problematic for assessing how threatened it is with extinction, but it also still misses out key regions. And so for all groups, at least a quarter of their records fall outside the designated ranges. And this varies by region. So in some regions, it's just inherently better than others. But in areas like Southeast Asia, the level of error is incredibly high. So let's think about the data we have as we've been doing. This is a portal that was developed by collaborators of Stuart Pym called biodiversitymapping.com, where they basically stacked these species range maps to map out biodiversity, which actually the IUCN says you shouldn't do, despite the fact a lot of people do. And as many people have called out problems with the IUCN maps, including the fact that they don't filter out habitat, a number of steps were put in place to try to make them better. But the problem is that these make inherent assumptions. To extract the habitat classification from the IUCN Red List, well, we did this for bats. The problem is that that habitat classification is very, very narrow. And it assumes that this is accurate and well-informed, where for many species, we don't have a good knowledge. It said that we should look at the maximum and minimum elevation, but not only is this data regularly missing from the IUCN Red List, but this may vary across the year, across the latitudes a species occurs at. If it has a large latitudinal range, it may occupy a different elevation in Xishuangbanna from the south of Malaysia because the climate is changing. And so this kind of approach ignores species ecology and it ignores basic assumptions that we have. And it says, okay, we should validate it with point data. But what we've seen from these maps is they still have massive errors of commission as well as omission. And we also know that these points may not be representative because most of them come from more disturbed areas. And so the question is, does this data, we've looked at the two broad types of data that we use for biodiversity mapping, does it allow us to develop priorities? Well, this is a map of roads of Australia, but it shouldn't be a map of roads of Australia. It's meant to be a map of biodiversity data. But the issue is that because of these accessibility biases, all of the data we have is from next to a road. And so is there an alternative to this point-based data? And as we've seen, there are alternatives, but they have different problems. And that means that actually they can be worse rather than better. And so those impressive numbers that we see in global reports are also often the product of unstandardized approaches where people have tried to amalgamate different sets of data that were not actually compiled for long-term comparable use. And so we need much better data if we are to understand where species are and how we can adequately conserve them into the future. So if the point data is biased and the polygon data is wrong, how do we actually move forward? Well, firstly, understanding the data we have and the limits of acceptable use is crucial if we're going to use it effectively. And so what other data is there and how can we meaningfully and effectively use it? So I'm going to be talking briefly about spatial prioritization, and I'll also talk, as I mentioned earlier, about the unsustainable use of species, which is shown by IPBES to be one of the greatest threats to species survival going into the future. Now, here are maps of biodiversity that are generated by using species distribution modeling. Species distribution modeling, like every other approach, has assumptions. It assumes that your data are representative of the region you're looking at, that it is relatively non-biased, and it has been collected in such a way that you haven't said, my frog lives on mountaintops, I'm only looking at mountaintops. Hey, I found my frog. And then plugging it into a model, and the model's like, yeah, it's on mountaintops. Because the models, of course, cannot differentiate your requirements as a researcher from your species requirements. So for all of these, we've collated data through field studies, through papers that have been published, as well as global biodiversity repositories. So we can try to ensure that the data is as representative of species ranges as possible. And based on that, we can map biodiversity patterns by stacking these different maps of species distributions, and then we can assess how well protected they are. And what we see, unfortunately, is in this region, for the majority of Southeast Asia, key areas for biodiversity are basically not conserved across the range of species. We can also use these kind of approaches to try to look at the impacts of infrastructure on biodiversity. So the red and purple lines you see here are proposed road and rail lines that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And for those of you who know Xishuangbanna well, this road is just connected up, actually going all the way to Luang Prabang in Laos through Xishuangbanna. And what we can see is many parts of these new infrastructural projects directly go through key areas for biodiversity. And of course, by mapping these out, we can try to develop appropriate means to mitigate it, to make sure we minimize fragmentation caused by new infrastructure, and that we create other modes of connectivity in areas that are going to be fragmented. There are also other considerations. If we were to go further north to places like Central Asia, what we can do is make sure that fencing, especially in areas that we know is being used by migratory species, does allow animals to move through it. So in the case of various migratory species in Central Asia, we know that by putting fences at least 40 centimeters above the ground means that they can still bypass them. We can also use these kinds of approaches to map out the ranges of migratory species. Migratory species are some of the most vulnerable to environmental change because they rely on their areas of key requirements being conserved across all parts of the year. And this means rather than conserving a single area, we need to recognize the dynamic use and how they vary over time. This is critically important within the Asian region, where over 50 million migratory birds annually migrate up and down the East Asian Australasian flyway. And unfortunately, some of those species have shown population losses of over 70% in recent years. Now, using this kind of approach and by partitioning the year into key times where species are using different areas, we can map out their range during both phases of migration, as well as during breeding and non-breeding seasons. But what we see when we compare this to the IUCN maps is the IUCN and BirdLife maps continue to miss key areas for biodiversity, as well as failing to represent stopover sites, which are critical to these species surviving into the future. And so by using these kinds of modeling approaches, by aggregating representative data on where species are and the ever-growing volumes of data on the environment, we can make much more detailed analysis of where species are and target conservation to these key areas for biodiversity as they shift in pattern across the year. And for groups like this, that includes the breeding, the overwintering, and the stopover sites, because a failure to conserve any parts of these will result in species showing declines or possibly becoming extinct. We can also use these kinds of approaches to reconnect the landscape. So, for example, we can use resilience approaches to create a resistance matrix, which is basically how hard it is for animals to move through the environment. And by stacking this up, by integrating it with approaches like circuitscape or other bridging analyses, we can actually show how we can optimize reconnecting a fragmented landscape to allow species to actually move through it in the face of growing fragmentation and deforestation. So there are a couple of different metrics we can use for species-based approaches to conservation. But as I noted earlier, for many species, we simply do not have adequate data to map out species by species where we need to conserve. And setting targets can be really challenging when many users are not aware of the biases that pervade the data. So developing new mechanisms to identify what those biases and to set new targets that are representative despite biases in the data are challenging. So I'll start off with an example of a very important group of pollinators, which is important for crops across the planet, given that pollinators pollinate something like 80% of all crop species. So first off, let's understand what those biases look like. DB here stands for database, so database sampling, database richness, and checklist richness. And so what we can see is that if we do a cartogram based on the database, we have massive sampling biases, we have significant richness biases, But if we use a checklist for comparison, we can see that the world has literally changed shape, with areas like Asia re-inflating, much of the African continent re-inflating, and South America also showing shifts. And in fact, in a region like Asia, we have 15% of the world's bee species, but only 1% of the world's bee data. And so developing any kind of representative high-resolution map when we have this level of bias is enormously challenging. And so what we did is we basically got inventories of diversity across the planet, and rather than modeling species by species, we modeled richness patterns. And we've now done that for several groups. So here is the same approach applied to termite species. So we can map out high-resolution maps of species distributions across much of the planet. The alternative to this, which has been done in the case of ants, is by working with researchers all over the planet to get sufficient data to model representative species worldwide. But it is very, very challenging to do and takes many years. And for many of these groups, we simply don't have the data. The other advantage is that both bees and termites are both ecosystem engineers and important providers of key ecosystem services. And so by providing these kind of matrix, we can actually start developing ecosystem service provision maps that include these more species-derived units. And so these are really important tools for us to be able to move forward and actually include those other dimensions of ecosystem service provision. When we're thinking about representativeness, we can also think about other types of data which we might be able to leverage. And in recent years, we have seen an exponential growth in the amount of data generated by citizen scientists. Now, data gathered by citizen scientists does have inherent problems. It's typically common species from easy to reach and highly disturbed areas. And so for rare species, we often still don't capture them in this data. However, it has two major advantages. One of them is its high temporal resolution, meaning that it's very useful for tracking species movements over time and capturing even small shifts in where species are. And the other is the degree of data and data coverage, meaning that you can see in areas like the Americas and Europe and Australia, they are in the red because of the high degree of coverage and completeness in the data. But there are still, of course, problems. So even using the eBird dataset, which has many, many millions of records and in fact now dominates every biodiversity dataset, there are still major gaping holes. And so we decided to see what other approaches we might be able to apply to data where we could try to reconstruct patterns of richness in the face of these glaring data biases. Because what we can see with this is almost 3/4 of all bird data is from the Nearctic, so North America, predominantly from the US. And if you have more than 3/4 of all data coming from basically one country, how do you use it to map out the globe? And so what we did is we created 10 plots from across the planet, and then we simulated different types of existing biases within the bird life polygon maps. Now, the polygon maps are not accurate, but they provide a useful backdrop for us to subsample so that we can try to see how we can reconstruct original patterns based on biased data inputs. And what we can see is, of course, at coarser resolutions, it becomes much easier, but we also see that different types of biodiversity index have very different performances. So we compared Hilbert's index, also known as ES50, hill numbers, Simpson and Shannon's index, a very basic species richness index, and Pearlew's index. These are all relatively common metrics. You will all have heard of Simpson and Shannon's, but people don't think about what they're using. They don't think about the assumptions, and they don't think about how well these different indices perform. And so by testing how they perform under these different types of bias, we can try to better understand what we should be using to better recapture and reconstruct these richness patterns. So what happens if we increase the road coverage, given that most data comes from near a road? All of them perform better, but hill numbers and Simpson index are always the best, with other variables performing variably, and ES50, Hilbert's index, and Pearlew's index generally performing the worst. And so all metrics perform differently, But then there was another issue. We decided to feed this into a species distribution model based on these indices and see to what level basically each of these indices construct the top levels of richness. And here we found that while Simpson Index performs well under all of the tests, it tends to overpredict areas with the highest levels of richness, meaning that you will end up with a much larger area of high richness than with the other metrics. And so what we found was that once we removed the poorly performing variables, having an average biodiversity index can actually help us reconstruct global patterns of biodiversity fairly accurately. Now remember, almost 3/4 of the data that was fed into this model came from this area. And yet we are still able to reconstruct patterns of richness fairly well, including places like the Atlantic forest, including across places like Papua New Guinea. And so whilst there are still errors, and I don't like how it is performing, actually the model for mainland Southeast Asia at a higher resolution performed better than this. This is the 10-kilometer resolution model, but it performed better for most areas. We can also directly use this kind of data to inform policy. So using one of those metrics, we did a global analysis of urban birds and then looked at high resolution at a number of different countries. And what we found was that in terms of urban birds, using a biodiversity index to standardize the level of sampling in these regions, we actually found the same patterns and drivers were important across most of the planet and across most biomes. So except for highly treed biomes, tree cover and net primary productivity are normally the best indicators of bird diversity. And so by just increasing the level of green space in almost any city, we can increase the number of species that are able to inhabit that city. And that's almost universal. And whilst it's not surprising, it does have implications for policy in areas where we are seeing increasing urbanization and the loss of this tree cover. We can also look at synergies as to how we can convert it into policy and look at complementarities with things like climate targets. So here we can see regional analysis. This is for biodiversity and this is for carbon. Here we see biome analysis and here we see national analysis. And by looking at where the synergies and overlaps exist, we can see that any target that primarily focuses on carbon is going to overemphasize fairly homogeneous regions to the north, whereas of course biodiversity targets will cover all rainforest regions basically. And so unless we explicitly incorporate biodiversity within any climate target, we can actually end up with perverse outcomes for biodiversity. But by looking at the complementarities between these and where we see synergy and overlap, we can effectively conserve over 90% of species in almost any taxa. But the bad news is it means that we would effectively need to halt further forest loss in hyperdiverse regions, including Indonesia. And that means that the current funding setup within conventions like the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework are simply not sufficient to enabling effective conservation in areas that are crucial if we're going to maintain biodiversity into the future. We can also use these kinds of approaches and blend them together to actually look at things like ecological conservation red lines. Now, ecological conservation red lines are a set of spatial targets that aim to conserve biodiversity, ecosystem service provision, and eco-fragility. And by uniting these, we can look for where synergies exist, and we can focus attention on areas where we get the maximum outcome for the minimum area of conservation. And so within this, we include a large number of different services, and we can then marry those up to create a strategy to help us moving into the future and maintaining maximum biodiversity and service provision in the most minimal area, which is much more attractive to governments. But it also shows that there is an unequal way to go in many countries, with countries like Myanmar having a particularly long way to go if they're going to effectively conserve these key areas, even for ecosystem service provision. Another method we can take is by actually mapping out the human footprint. And this is a footprint here that we created ourselves that does not include rivers because rivers are natural features, but does include dams and mines. And by using this or even inverting it, so here is a map of relatively intact habitats superimposed with productivity across the planet to basically show us areas that we should focus on conserving because they are relatively intact and have the potential for hosting high biodiversity. And we can also feed this into other approaches, like looking at the potential for depth for nature swaps within these areas. We can also map out other forms of service provision. So here is a map of old world fruit bat biodiversity, and then we can interlink it with a service map for pollination and seed dispersal. This one includes over 5,000 bat-plant interactions, including pollination or seed dispersal, to map out the functionality of bats in these regions. So we can actually target ecosystem function and ensure that we conserve species in the areas they depend on when they are crucial not only for ecosystem health, but also may have economic returns. And we can also implement this across the landscape, ensuring that we maximize connectivity in these landscapes so we can increase the level of service provision and protect biodiversity. And we can look at things like, how does the pollination network structure vary with proximity to these forest environments? So include these spatial interactions with interaction networks at all scales to provide a better and more accurate currency for conserving areas into the future. We can also develop specific indicators for different systems. So here is some work that was led by Chris Natanalgo, another former member of my team, that was looking at the Bat Cave Vulnerability Index. And by looking at measures of both biodiversity and threat for these different caves, and again comparing it to the IUCN index, we can try to develop better targets for conservation. We also need to think about One Health. For example, we've done mapping of what viruses bats are hosting in different systems, and we can actually look at the interaction between habitat health and species health to help us maintain healthy environments into the future, as well as maintaining service provision. By reflecting these different facets of the environment, species ecology, ecophysiology, and service provision, we can have a much more dynamic way of moving forward and conserving the systems we rely on as we move into the future. In these maps, we show that at least 24 species were predicted to coexist in certain areas. And so by targeting areas where we have maximum diversity, we could also ensure that we have the tools and approaches to maintain diversity in these systems, as well as understanding risks like potential spillover. So we need to think about how we conserve biodiversity in this changing world. For global conservation to be successful, we need to understand the drivers of biodiversity loss and what is causing them. This also includes looking at things like, what are supply chain tracking networks looking like? How many partners are there? What is the impact on host countries if we are losing biodiversity in key areas? Where are we sourcing our products from? And by better understanding this, we can try to better conserve biodiversity and to actually put much more responsibility on consuming nations to create systems and functions that allow us to maintain biodiversity. And this includes coupling the spatial data from these host countries with the areas that it gets developed to. And mechanisms like supply chain tracking are likely to be crucial if we are to maintain biodiversity into the future. And we can also map out hotspots of sensitivity to other things. So here is some work that I contributed to last year, led by UNEP WCMC, the World Monitoring Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. And what we can see is when we look at the amount of potential biodiversity loss associated with future infrastructure, areas like parts of Indonesia, as well as Papua, are some of the most at risk of losses of biodiversity related to this future infrastructure. So we need to remember most of the world remains unsampled. The data we have is spatially, temporally, and taxonomically not representative. And when standards are created, we need to think about how we can better share the data so that we are able to use it to better inform models, mapping, and conservation assessment. We can also use checklists to help ensure that our data is clean and accurate, as well as to provide a comparator to see how representative our data is. We can have meaningful layers of different dimensions of diversity so we can develop better and smarter targets, which better encompass different facets of ecosystem service provision and provide us with a means of moving forwards towards targets. And we can also include better metrics to enable us to monitor the environment, things like using bioacoustic analysis or camera traps to provide a much more real-time view of what species are in ecosystems. So we need to look at synergies. If we don't integrate biodiversity targets with climate targets, we risk failing at both and also losing critical services that are crucial to our survival on this planet. Biodiversity has to be part of the solution. And so rather than approaches like the billion-tree tsunami or the Great Green Wall of Africa and China, which showed major mortality in their trees, we need to prioritize protecting and existing systems and then restoring native but disturbed ecosystems. Conventions also must work in synergy to maximize benefits. And better data is needed for targets, but these targets also need to reflect human needs. And we need to have much better assessment and monitoring so that we can use the data more effectively. So I've already been talking for 50 minutes. What I think I'm going to do is skip to the end rather than talking more about the direct exploitation now. So I'm going to briefly talk about what we can better do as scientists. So one, we need to fill the data gaps. Most of the world's surface still has no data for the majority of species. There are long and short-term solutions whilst we aggregate more data, but we need to be very careful when we do use data that we don't use it beyond the limits of sensible use. Because if we do, we actually generate the wrong solution, and sometimes we misdirect efforts rather than directing them where they are needed to conserve biodiversity. Poor use of data undermines credibility of scientists, misuses funds, and can actually damage effective conservation solutions. And we need to collaborate so that we can access the best data and also effectively use it. So again, we don't use it beyond its limits. And we can also draft things like policy briefs so that the people who are trying to work on the data can actually understand the limits of that data. Conservation policy can also only be implemented if it's translated into an appropriate context and language and made available. Sociocultural components are also needed for solutions to be effective, and providing solutions within appropriate frameworks is absolutely essential. And priorities need a firm foundation of data and include risk assessment. We only have 7 years to actually achieve the 2030 targets and to prepare ourselves for the 2050 vision, which will follow from then. To be ready from this point, we actually need a clearer understanding and better baseline data, and we need to have a much clearer understanding of what data we have to develop better targets. We also need to have better integration of different types of data, as well as different targets and conventions, so we understand the trade-offs and the synergies that exist between all of them. So to facilitate effective conservation, we need to collate that data. We need to assess the spatial priorities of conservation. We need to integrate One Health dynamics, especially in landscape management, to assess threats, particularly wildlife trade, as well as other drivers of biodiversity loss, and to understand the mechanistic approaches to mainstream conservation policy and practice. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, to thank the many different collaborators that I have, and now I'm just about on time to take any questions. Thank you all. Questions?
Sorry.
So
Hello?
does anyone have questions?
Yeah. Anyone have a question? Okay. I just make a summary of what Alice talked from the first to to the end of the first lecture, and yeah, it's nice outline, I think, and and the first Alice warning us about the crisis of biodiversity, and when we talking about the crisis and how to solve, and then we look to the data, and we found that we don't have enough data actually, and how to get the data and how to find data. Yeah, that's the most problem. And Alice also introduced us about modeling from the already now data and how to say it, model to find to predict the distribution, and also and from the modeling, and we found many location that actually is not protected area, and that's also a problem. And also Alice talking about yeah, many research, many mapping and modeling. So that's kind of a interesting thing, and I hope a student can get insight or brainstorming from the talk. Okay, any question or comments?
A lot of information for people to process. For those of you who are interested, a lot of what I talked about are publications we've had in the last few years. So I'm very happy to send anyone who is interested some of the publications, or you can look at my Google Scholar page or my ResearchGate and find a lot of these publications.
Yeah, you did a lot of mapping and modeling, and
yes.
you know that we are the Department of Biology, and mapping and modeling is kind of how to say it's a combination of technology, information, IT, and data scientists, data science. And so how to the question is how to connect biology and yeah, because we are here in Andalas University, is modeling and data science is kind of yeah, difficult. Yeah, it's how to deal with this.
So it's very challenging to do all of it, but the more data we have, the better. One way to start is upload the data that you can collect. So things like iNaturalist or GBIF are good ways of storing that data. And of course, the fact that people can now compete to get the most records is a really encouraging way to get people to collect that data. If you are wanting to model it more broadly, then the best approach is to actually do fairly standardized systematic analysis where you go and you survey different regions, and then you can start to develop models with it. For some of these taxa, of course, there is existing data within those data portals that you can use to complement the data that you collect. But to do these things well, a lot of data is needed. But the more data we have, especially from areas which are under collected and under surveyed, the better we are able to try to conserve these species.
Okay. Yeah. To do the modeling, so we need to collect the data. My question is how we, yeah, actually I is really interesting on the data science and how to say in computer, because mapping and modeling is we do a lot in computer, and but most of the student is not so familiar with the computer and data science in here in biology. Nowadays we feel the data science, statistic, and data analysis it's so important, and how to encourage students to learn about this. And in our course, and in my course in biodiversity mapping and modeling, I just teach students to make a map, simple map, like using QGIS, and then start some modeling, and then finally I did a maximum entropy
Yeah.
to do the. So, but how to what is your suggestion how to get how to attract students to increase more, because the modeling mapping it's so fast
It's a powerful tool. So when it's done well, of course, you can then map potential biodiversity in areas that you haven't surveyed. And that means you can be much more efficient, because rather than having to go everywhere, if you can map out where a species probably is, then you can go and survey that area and save a lot of time. And so if your students like either computers or they want to save time in the field, then using models is a very efficient way to try to optimize that time use better.
And okay, any other question or comments? Yeah, Kin, so please introduce yourself, and then any comments or question?
Yeah, hello.
We can hear you, Ken.
My name is Ken Duzate, and I'm now from biology department. I'm studying technique civil, like civil engineering, studying PhD degree related with aquid. So may I ask a question? According to your point of view, it's like biodiversity can affect the geodiversity. It's like,
yeah, so that's a really good question. One of the variables we'll often include when we're mapping biodiversity are things like soil variables. Geology is very useful, but often the maps aren't accurate. But the more geodiversity is, the more heterogeneous the landscape is. The more heterogeneous the landscape is, the higher the turnover between different communities. And so where we have high geodiversity, we expect there to be high biodiversity. This is also particularly going to be the case for certain types of taxa. So as well as that high geodiversity contributing to high turnover of species overall, if there are certain types of geodiversity that are more likely to lead to things like cave evolution, then of course you amplify it even more because you have different sets of taxa that are adapted to those habitats. So yeah, when we're trying to understand biogeography, considerations of geodiversity is absolutely essential for us to have any idea of where species might be.
So my question is, how much is biodiversity can affect in changing the geodiversity? It's like vice versa.
So you can't set a set amount because it's going to vary depending on the system. But overall, there is a strong relationship between geodiversity and biodiversity. And of course, that's also going to break down in a highly modified area. So if an area has very high geodiversity, but then you clear all the forest, you're still going to lose the species. And so we need to think about the nuances within that relationship.
Yeah, it's like, for example, if how can I say that? It's like geodiversity, one geodiversity is damaged, it's like flooding will occur like that. And that time the species from the sea will be broken. And it's like that, for example, if the species in the seas or ocean is broken, it's like how, I mean, it's like question, I don't know, it is possible or not, how much extent geodiversity can be damaged?
Well, I mean, a mine would be damaging geodiversity. It's difficult to quantify it exactly because a lot of it is going to be situational depending on the particular ecosystem. But maintaining all forms of diversity is also going to help correlate with each other. And so because they relate, if you lose geodiversity, you will lose biodiversity. If you lose biodiversity, then you're still not going to undermine the overall structural landscape, but we do need to have a healthy ecosystem to maintain the species that depend on it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. And also thank you so much for our country, Myanmar, very intention to do
Yeah.
your research.
Myanmar is a very important country as well. And in areas like Hakabo Razi, we are also seeing very high rates of species description now. So good luck with your work there because it is an important area.
Yeah, we appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kin from Myanmar. So yeah, maybe in the future collaborate between biodiversity and geodiversity. It's kind of really interesting and promising, I think. Okay, any other question or comments from all of attendants?
Yep, we have
Yeah.
one from Tariq Alpha.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Aad and Ms. Alice. My name is Tariq Alfat, and I'm a master student in Andalas University. I'm a student of Aad Adrian. And then from now, I'm recently studying about cliff flora diversity in one cliff in West Sumatra. From now, for my thesis, I will studying about in West Sumatra province about the cliff flora. So for the modeling, should we use one object, or we can put a lot of object like flora in our modeling? Maybe like that is my question. Thank you.
So again, it depends on the type of model we're using. Normally, when we're creating a model, we wanted to incorporate all of the variables that could be important for our species, but we do also need it to be statistically valid. And so we don't want more variables than are useful or ones that correlate very strongly with each other. So we will run a number of tests to try to help us optimize variable selection. But when you are selecting any kinds of variables for the model, the best way to start is thinking about your species ecology and then structuring the selection of your variables around that. And then you can run various analysis. There are even R packages to help you optimize it now, but you need to start off by thinking about the species ecology and what its dependencies are. So where does it sleep at night? Where does it forage? What is causing its diet to be available? Think about those kinds of factors and use those to help you select the variables that you're using.
Okay, thank you for your suggestion. I hope it will make good for my thesis. Thank you, Ms.
Okay, any other question? Thank you very much, Tariq, from student of biology in Andalas University. Yeah, I saw also our former student like Ade, Taufik. Yeah.
People are also welcome to contact me later, and you've recorded this, so if you want to distribute the recording and people want to play it slowly, then they can always send me more questions after re-listening to short snippets of it.
Yeah. Okay, any other question from student or from I saw also some lecturer here. Okay, question from me. Do you what is your opinion, challenge or an opportunity biodiversity mapping and modeling in particularly in Indonesia or Sumatra? So we our students start to model several topics like tiger conflict and tiger how currently one of my students predict how forest loss affect tiger distribution, and well, I want to know what is the challenging or opportunity for mapping and modeling of biodiversity in Sumatra or Indonesia, in your opinion?
Yeah, so there's a number of different factors that are going to present a challenge. One is the biodiversity data and one is the environmental data. So if you're just modeling conflicts, those are a product of a subset of the areas that are part of that species range. And so in order to model that, you need good data on where the conflicts are. And this is something that you will include human population density, probably distance to things like livestock, because some of them are going to be depredating livestock. And it's when humans go into those areas, you have a real risk. And then you need a number of habitat variables, including the degree of disturbance. What you might also want to consider if you're looking at what's driving conflict is the health of the prey base. So animals like tigers would typically feed on a small number of other species, but if all of those species have been collected or have been wiped out, then they have to feed on something else. And so you may also want some layer that is an indicator of the health of other taxa that are the main prey of the tiger. And there have been a number of models that are similar to that on species like the snow leopard, where there has been accounting for the actual prey base of those species. Now, in terms of the spatial data, that is a lot better than it was even 5 years ago. So as well as high resolution data on various facets of the environment, like forest cover and forest density, etc., there are now much higher resolution human population density. And of course, you can also use things like the lights at night and things like the time since disturbance. And so once again, thinking about how these factors interact are very important. The reality is that the number of carnivore attacks, the amount of human-wildlife conflict has sometimes increased in recent years because species are losing the resources they need in native areas, and that is forcing them to use these human-modified areas, and that is also going to drive up conflict. And so encompassing that within a map should also factor in when was habitat loss, so what is the rate of habitat loss, but also things like reflecting the actual functional integrity and if they still have access to their prey base, or if they're being forced to shift because they've lost access to basically enough food to eat unless they start using these more modified areas.
Okay. Okay, any other comments or question? One of the technical question. What kind of practice or like a tool or software that we should master to do the modeling and mapping?
Well, I mean, the most important thing is just thinking as an ecologist. I use ArcMap a lot, but I also use Quantum GIS sometimes. As long as you can use one of those reasonably well, you can do fairly well. A knowledge of R is helpful, but it's not essential. And then, of course, things like Maxent have a GUI framework, so you don't need anything for that. But even for people who want to model in R, they should always have a working knowledge of GIS, because understanding the spatial relationship between different factors is important and gives you the ability to actually critique your outputs, to think about if they're sensible, to think about if they're representative. And sometimes the very best questions come from actually looking at your outputs or looking at your maps and making sure that what you're doing makes sense and the outputs are reliable and representative. And so I would encourage everyone to learn things like QGIS, because it is a very powerful tool and it will help you develop better questions for understanding these systems.
Okay. Yeah,
Ade.
so that's me. Ade. Yeah, please show your face, Ade. I to see your face.
Hello,
Okay.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Hello, Pak, and also hi to all the teachers in Andalas University. It's nice to see all my teachers and also Alice are here. I have a question for Alice that related to your presentation, the first slides that you're mentioning about population and also consumption, human population and also consumption. So when we were mapping a biodiversity or richness map, let's say in Indonesia, and we pick important variables and we produce a good map. And then when it comes to development in Indonesia, for example, what is your opinion when the government want to open access, like open a road for isolated villages in several provinces in Indonesia? But according to our map, that area has like lots of species diversity and richness. But of course, in the government opinion, they do need to open access for a human, for the better wealth of villagers in that location. So how can we somehow make wealthy? We think about wealthy and also think about the biodiversity. What is your opinion about this when it overlaps like that? Thank you, Alice.
So it's a great question. The best answer I can give actually comes from the example of Costa Rica. So in Costa Rica, the former Minister for the Environment was also the Minister for Mines and Agriculture, and he was in charge of land development. And they had that exact question where they needed to develop new road infrastructure that was going to go right through the rainforest. And so what they did in that case is they actually designated both sides of the rainforest as protected areas before they built the road. And so that would help stop any further what we call herringbone impacts. So when you build a new road, typically you get development going both sides of the road. If you can stop that, though it's much harder to stop the collection of non-timber forest products like animals for pets, you can at least stop conversion to agriculture. And it is now even more detectable because we have high resolution imagery data. So the first stop is if you really have to help build connectivity and you can't move that population or they don't want to move, then the best thing is to actually protect either side of this new road, which means it's much harder to develop secondary development. The next thing you need to think about is what other resources does this population need? And so something else we see that often causes deforestation is when something like a new dam or a new pylon or something like that, new power infrastructure is built. There is now much better technology, which means we don't necessarily need to plug them into the main power network. There are much better things like freestanding turbines you can put in rivers to generate electricity, local solar grids, etc. And so that way you can contain the local infrastructure so you don't get a spider web of impacts going outwards from these now more accessible settlements. And by implementing these new protected areas, you can limit the further growth and sprawl and development. And then after that, it becomes very difficult to stop the collection of wildlife. But that way you've got a stepwise approach to maintaining some elements. And you can also maintain connectivity of the forests and reduce fragmentation over the route using things like underpasses in certain areas. And so that way, whilst it doesn't completely eliminate losses, in places like Costa Rica, where it was coupled with a lot of ecotourism development, they haven't seen any deforestation because they said, okay, we need to develop this new infrastructure, but we don't want it to drive losses. We are going to strictly enforce that prevention of deforestation either side of the road. And because there is enough traffic as well, it would get spotted. And those types of approach can be very effective when done well.
Thank you, Alice. I think Indonesia should adopt that kind of approach. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Ade.
Hi,
And good
Pat.
seeing you. Bye
Good
for
to see
now.
you as well.
Yeah, Ade, please come to our campus again, and we can discuss more about a future project or something collaboration.
Sure, Pat. Yes, thank you, Pat. I think I will come to Andalas University next year. I might execute some project in Indonesia, so I will come to Andalas and share a little bit of my work as well.
Okay, we are looking forward to it. Okay, thank you very much, Ade. And any other question or comment from our student? Yeah, if you fear about your English, you can express your question in Indonesia, and then I can translate it to English. So no problem. Any other question or comments? Yeah. Okay. So now I'm regarding to the your school, biology science school in University of Hong Kong. So so what is the current topic or current research topic regarding yeah, maybe or mapping or biodiversity modeling or other topic now?
I mean, there's a lot of researchers here, so people work on different things. I basically work on whatever I think is meaningful and important. And when I have students, we try to co-develop projects where they can work on something that they truly love and that they can be the best researcher they can be. So people here work on a lot of things and I work on a lot of things.
Yeah, I saw your Google Scholar. It's you work on a lot of many kind of, you work tiger, amphibian, and yes, many things.
I tell people I'm easily bored, so I have to work on a lot of things, otherwise I'd be bored. But in reality, there are a lot of threats to Southeast Asian biodiversity, and by having a holistic understanding, we can do a lot better. And so if I'm talking to a minister about wildlife trade and they start asking me about something else, I want to be able to give a reasonably good answer to that. And so I try to have a broad understanding of all elements of biodiversity.
So in your opinion, what is the opportunity doing research for you to Indonesia? So if you come to Indonesia,
there's always opportunities. Indonesia is a hyper-diverse region, which still has quite high rates of deforestation, despite some recent initiatives to try to stem that. There's a huge amount of collaborative work that is needed. You have incredible biodiversity. You have a huge number of species that are not scientifically described yet. There is a lot that is to be done. And by building partnerships and collaborating, then we can all achieve more together. And one reason I came to this region, and my team has always been predominantly from Asia, is because no matter how long I'm in Asia, I'm clearly always going to be the European. I can't develop the best solutions for this region, but I can work with people who can. And by helping people have the best understanding of the science and the tools, then together we can develop the solutions and affect change to conserve this region. And especially in a place like Indonesia with so much biodiversity, there's always going to be more we need to do. And the people listening to this chat are the best people to be doing that science and developing those solutions.
And what is your project with Ada now?
Ada, why don't you turn on your camera and you can talk about your project?
Ada, so please.
I thought I'm hiding really well already. So we currently now working on the migration of bats. So we developed still continue basically work from the data that we have from my PhD in Sichuan Bana. So we are now, what we do now is to create the isoscape. It's the to mapping out the isotope of the precipitation data across the China and also the Southeast Asia, and then see how the bat species might migrate and move around the area by looking at the differences between the isotope composition that we record from the bats here and the isotope precipitation. So that's one project that we are currently working on, and then there are several other projects that still in the line, one by one actually, which also included in the plan to also doing some sort of field work in Indonesia, but we don't really like sorting out when and how we're gonna conduct this, so it's still also on the plan. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Indonesia is part of our plans, and Ada still needs to take me to some more Indonesian caves that we can do sampling from as well.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, I saw your research, Alice, also talking about social media, and yeah. So so many things you did research. And so for future, I mean, prospective students. So if our student want to continue PhD or master degree in your lab, so what is current topic or
I mean,
requirement?
to me, the most important topic is, well, them being passionate about their work and determined, because doing this kind of work is hard work. It requires a lot of stubbornness, passion. And I mean, Ade and Ada are both here now. Both of them were passionate students before they joined me, and it has been a real privilege working with them as they've been able to develop tools to help fulfill those dreams of their own. And so I don't look for students that necessarily have all the answers. I look for students who are willing to do the work so that they can find the answers and develop more questions. And to me, that independence, that passion, those are the most important things, because that is what turns someone into a great researcher. Anything else is just bookwork. And I would rather have people who want to go out and do interesting stuff.
Yeah. I hope the student can hear your explanation. The passionate is one of the most important. So if you thinking about something and you're passionate about that, and you will be success. Okay. Any other question or comments from student?
Well, people are welcome to get in touch with me later. Terima kasih for listening to me for an hour and a half. And yeah, more questions are welcome at any time, and we can continue to talk about what other collaborations and things might be possible.
Okay, there is no more question. Or comments? Okay, yeah, seems there is no more question, comments. And yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. So very huge of information. You summarize from the crisis biodiversity and how to deal with data and mapping and modeling and so many information. So yeah, I'm really interested in the data source that you show in the map, because some of the slide is without any source reference. So
a lot of it is from my research. So if people go to my Scholar or my ResearchGate, they'll find a lot of that, but people are also welcome to reach out to me.
Okay, thank you. Great. I will explore your Scholar. And yeah, and then another how to say, yeah, we are going to continue. Would you want to continue this collaboration, not only now just a guest lecture? So is it possible to, like, for the future, for further collaboration, that we will invite you come to Indonesia?
I would be happy to.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, we hope that we will get some yeah, opportunity for that, and then we will invite you to come to Indonesia and make interaction to our student, and share the passionate thing to the student, and then make many Ada and Ade future. Because we are really proud for Ada and Ade. So, and we always tell the student, Ada and Ade is one example of our student, good student, passionate student. Okay,
I'm proud of them too.
Yes, thank you very much.
And now they've both got their cameras hidden so that no one can see if they're blushing or giggling. It's been a pleasure working with them, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of the other things that they achieve.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. And
so, and we can continue to talk and plan for a more 3D meeting.
Okay, Okay, now we are in the end of the guest lecture, and thank you very much for all of attending here, and for student, for lecturer, and also from the other person from outside of Andalas University, because our guest lecture is open to all. And this guest lecture is recorded and also in YouTube available. And if you want to repeat again what Alice talking about, you can just watching the YouTube, and then you can pause and or replay and some because Alice talking is so fast. I think. Because but many information, so I will replay this her presentation. So many things. Okay, thank you very much, and Alice, thank you very much. Ada, thank you very much, and Ade and other students. And we close this guest lecture. Yeah, see you again, and thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih. Selamat.
Terima kasih. 谢谢。